Dragonsong, Chapter 4. Black, blacker, blackest, and cold beyond frozen things, where is between when there is not to life but fragile dragon wings. Despite her mother's care in cleaning the wound, Manoli's hand was swollen by evening and she was feverish with pain. One of the old aunts sat with her, placing cool cloths on her head and face, and gently crooning what she thought would be a comforting song. The notion was misplaced, since even in her delirium, Manoli was aware that music had now been forbidden her. She became more irritated and restless. Finally, Mavi dosed her liberally with Felis juice and wine, and she fell into a deep slumber. This proved to be a blessing, because the hand had so swollen that it was obvious some of the packtail slime had gotten into the bloodstream. Manoli called in one of the other hold women deft in such matters. Luckily for Manoli, they decided to release the coarse stitches to allow better drainage of the infection. They kept Manoli heavily dosed and hourly changed the hot poulticing of her hand and arm. Packtail infection was pernicious, and Mavi was dreadfully afraid that they might have to remove Manoli's arm to prevent a further spread. She was constantly by her daughter's side, an attention that Manoli would have been surprised and gratified to receive, but she remained unconscious. Fortunately, the angry red lines faded on the girl's swollen arm on the evening of the fourth day. The swelling receded, and the edges of the terrible gash assumed the healthier color of healing flesh. Throughout her delirium, Manoli kept begging them to let her play just once more, just once again, pleading in such a pitiful tone that it all but broke Mavi's heart to realize that unkind fortune had made that impossible. The hand would always be crippled, which was as well, since some of the new Harper's questions were provoking Yanis. Elgian very much wanted to know who had drilled the youngsters in their teaching songs and ballads. At first, thinking that Manoli had been nowhere near as skilled as everyone had assumed, Yanis had told Elgian that a fosterling had undertaken the task, and he'd returned to his own hold just prior to the Harpers' arrival. Whoever did has the makings of a good Harper then, Elgian told his new holder. Old Paterian was a better teacher than most. The praise unexpectedly disturbed Yanis. He couldn't retract his words, and he didn't want to admit to Elgian that the person was a girl. So Yanis decided to let matters stand. No girl could be a Harper anyway, the road turned. Manoli was too old now to be in any of the classes, and he'd see that she was busy with other things until she came to think of her playing as some childish fancy. At least she hadn't disgraced the hold. He was, of course, sorry that the girl had cut herself so badly, and not entirely because she was a good worker. Still, it kept her out of the Harper's way until she forgot her silly tuning. Once or twice, though, while Manoli was ill, he missed her clear, sweet voice and counter-song, the way she and Paterian used to sing. Yet he dismissed the matter from his mind. Women had more to do than sit about singing and playing. There were exciting doings in the holds and weirs, according to Elgian's private report to him. Troubles, too, deep and worrisome enough to take his mind from the minor matter of a wounded girl. One of the questions that Harper Elgian often posed concerned the Seahold's attitude towards their weir, Bendon. Elgian was curious as to how often they came in contact with the old-timers at Istaweir. How did Yanis and his holders feel about dragon riders? About the weir leader and weirwoman of Bendon? If they resented dragon men going on search for young boys and girls of the holds and craft halls to become dragon riders? Had Yanis or any of his hold ever attended a hatching? Yanis answered the questions with the fewest possible words, and at first this seemed to satisfy the Harper. Half circles always ties to Bendon Weir, even before Thread fell. We know our duty to our weir, and they do theirs by us. Not a single burrow of Thread since the fall started 7 or more turns ago. Old-timers? Well, with half circle beholden to Bendon Weir, we don't see much of any of the other weirs. Not as the people in Karun or Narat might when the fall overlaps 2 weirs' boundaries. Very glad we were that the old-timers would come between so many hundreds of turns to help our time out. Dragon men are welcome any time at Half Circle. Come spring and fall, the women are here anyway, gathering sea beach plums and marshberries, grasses and the like. Welcome to all they want. Never met weirwoman Lessa. I see her on her queen Ramoth in the sky after a fall now and then. Weir leader Flar's a fine fellow. Search? Did they find any likely lad at half circle, it will be to our honour, and he's our leave to go. Although the problem had never worried the sea holder, no one from half circle had answered a search, which was as well, Yanis thought privately. If a lad happened to be chosen, every other lad in the hold would take to grumbling that he should have been picked. And on the seas of Pern, you had to keep your mind on your work, not on dreams. Bad enough to have those pesky fire lizards appearing now and then by the Dragonstones, but as no one could get near enough to the stones to catch a fire lizard, no harm was done. If the new harper found his holder an unimaginative man, hard-working and hidebound, he had been well prepared for it by his training. His problem was that he must provoke a change, subtle at first in what he found, for Master Harper Robinson wanted each of his journeymen to get every holder and craftmaster to think beyond the needs of their own lands, halls, and people. Harpers were not simply tellers of tales and singers of songs. They were arbiters of justice, confidants of holders and craftmasters, and molders of the young. Now, more than ever, it was necessary to alter hidebound thinking, to get everyone, starting with the young and working on the old, to consider more of Pern than the land they kept thread-free or the problems of their particular area. Many old ways needed shaking up, revising. If Flar of Bend and Weir hadn't done some shaking up, if Lessa hadn't made her fantastic ride back 400 turns to bring up the missing 5 weirs of dragon riders, Pern would be writhing under thread, with nothing green and growing left on the surface. The weirs had profited, and so had Pern. Similarly, the holds and crafts would profit if they only were willing to examine new ideas and ways. Half Circle could expand, Elgian thought. The present quarters were becoming cramped. The children had told him that there were more caves in the adjacent bluffs, and the dock cavern could accommodate more than the 30-odd craft now anchored so safely there. By and large, though, Elgian was rather relieved at his situation, since this was his first post as harper. He had his own well-furnished apartments in the hold, enough to eat, though the diet of fish might soon pall on a man accustomed to red meat, and the sea holders were generally pleasant people, if a little dour. Only one thing puzzled him. Who had drilled the children so perfectly? Old Paterian had sent word to the harper that there was a likely songmaker at Half Circle, and he had introduced 2 scored melodies that had greatly impressed the master harper. Paterian had also said that there'd be some difficulty in the sea-hold about the songmaker. A new harper, for Paterian had known that he was dying when he wrote the master harper, would have to go carefully. This was a hold that had kept much to itself and observed all the old ways. So, Elgian had kept his counsel on the matter of the songmaker, certain that the lad would make himself known. Music was hard to deny, and based on the 2 songs Elgian had been shown, this lad was undeniably musical.
Except that it's not a lad.
However, if the chap were a fosterling and away from the hold, he'd have to await his return. Elgian had soon managed to visit all the smaller holds in the half-circle palisade and gotten to know most people by name. The young girls would flirt with him or gaze at him with sorrowful eyes and sigh when he played in the evenings at the Great Hall. There was really no way in which Elgian would have realized that Manoli was the person he wanted. The children had been told by the sea holder that the harper would not like to know that they'd been drilled by a girl, so they were not to bring disgrace on the hold by telling him. After Manoli cut her hand so badly, it was rumored that she'd never use it again, so everyone was told that it would be heartless to ask her to sing in the evenings. When Manoli was well of the infection and her hand healed but obviously stiff, no one was thoughtless enough to remind her of her music. She herself stayed away from the singing in the Great Hall, and since she could not use her hand well, and so many occupations in the hold required too, she was frequently sent away in the day to gather greens and fruits, usually alone. If Mavi was perplexed by the quietness and passivity of her younger child, she put it down to the long and painful recovery, not to loss of her music. Mavi knew that all manner of pain and trouble could be forgotten in time, and so she did her best to keep her daughter occupied. Mavi was a very busy woman, and Manoli kept out of her way. Gathering greens and fruit suited Manoli perfectly. It kept her out in the open and away from the hold, away from people. She would have her morning drink, bread and fish quietly in the great kitchen when everyone was dashing around to feed the men of the hold, either going out to fish or coming back in from a night's sailing. Then Manoli would wrap up a fish roll and take one of the nets or skin slings. She'd tell the old aunt in charge of the pantry that she was going out for whatever it was, and since the old aunt had a memory like a seine net, she wouldn't remember that Manoli had done the same thing the day before, or realize that she would do the same the day after. When spring was fully warming the air and making the marshes brilliant with green and blossom color, spider claws began to walk in from the sea to lay their eggs in the shallower cove waters.
Whoa, what the heck is a spider claw?
What does it sound like it might be? It lives by the sea, it walks like a spider, and it has claws.
Oh, it's a crab.
You've
been crabbed.
Okay.
Crab rave.
As these plump shellfish were a delicacy in themselves, besides adding flavor to every dish when dried or smoked, the young people of the hold, Manoli with them, were sent off with traps, spades, and nets. Within 4 days, the nearby coves were picked clear of spider claws, and the young harvesters had to go farther along the coast to find more. With thread due to fall any time, it was unwise to stray too far from the hold, so they were told to be very careful. There was another danger that concerned the sea holder considerably. Tides had been running unusually high and full this turn. Much higher water in the harbor, and they'd not get the 2 big sloops in or out of the cavern unless they unstepped the masts. Due notice was taken of the high tide lines, and there was much shaking of heads when it was observed that the line was 2 full hands higher than ever before recorded. The lower caverns of the hold were checked against possible seepage. Bags of sand were filled and placed along the lower portions of the seawalls around the harbor.
Can you stop for a sec while I go get milk?
Yeah, sure.
Milk.
A good storm, and the causeways would be awash. Yanis was concerned enough to have a long chat with old Uncle to see if he remembered anything from his earlier and clearer days of sea holding. Old Uncle was delighted to talk and ranted on about the influence of the stars, but when Yanis, Elgian, and 2 of the other older shipmasters had sifted through what he'd said, it was not to any great increase in knowledge. Everyone knew that the 2 moons affected the tides, not the 3 bright stars in the sky. They did, however, send a message about these curious tides to Egan Hold, to be forwarded with all possible speed to the main seacraft hold at Fort. Yanis didn't want to have his biggest boats caught out in the open, so he kept careful check on the tides, determined to leave them within the dock cavern if the tide rose another hand higher. When the youngsters went out to gather spider claws, they were told to keep their eyes open and report back anything unusual, especially new high water marks on the coves. Only thread deterred the more adventurous lads from using this as an excuse for ranging far down the coast. Manoli, who preferred to explore the more distant places alone, mentioned thread to them as often as possible. Then, after the next threadfall, when everyone was sent out for spider claws, Manoli made certain she got a head start on the boys, making good use of her long legs. It was fine to run like this, Manoli thought, putting yet another rise between her and her nearest pursuers. She altered her stride for uneven ground. It wouldn't do to break an ankle now. Running was something even a girl with a crippled hand could do well. Manoli closed her mind to that thought. She'd learned the trick of not thinking about anything. She counted. Right now she counted her strides. She ran on, her eyes sweeping ahead to save her feet. The boys would never catch her now, but she was running for the sheer joy of the physical effort, chanting a number to each stride. She ran until she got a stitch in her side and her thighs felt the strain. She slowed, turning her face into the cool breeze blowing offshore, inhaling deeply of its freshness and sea odors. She was somewhat surprised to see how far she had come down the coast. The Dragonstones were visible in the clear air, and it was only then that she recalled the little queen. Unfortunately, she also remembered the tune she'd made up that day. That last day, Manoli now realized, of her trusting childhood. She walked on, following the line of the bluffs, peering down to see if she could spot new high water marks on the stone escarpments. Tide was halfway in now, Manoli decided, and yes, she could see the lines of sea debris from the last tide, in some places right up against the cliff face, and this had been a cove with a deep beach. A movement above, a sudden broadening of the sun made her gaze upwards. A sweeprider. Knowing perfectly well he couldn't see her, she waved vigorously anyhow, watching the graceful glide as the pair dwindled into the distance. Sela had told her one evening when they were preparing for bed that Elgian had flown on dragons several times. Sela had given a quiver of delighted terror, vowing that she wouldn't have the courage to ride a dragon. Privately, Manoli thought that Sela wouldn't likely have the opportunity. Most of Sela's comments and probably thoughts were centered on the new harbor. Sella was not the only one Manoli knew. If Manoli could think how silly all the Hold girls were being about Harper Elgian, it didn't hurt so much to think about Harpers in general. Again she heard the fire lizards before she saw them. Their excited chirpings and squeals indicated something was upsetting them. She dropped to a crouch and crept to the edge of the bluff, overlooking the little beach. Only there wasn't much beach left, and the fire lizards were hovering over a spot on the small margin of sand, almost directly below her. She inched up to the edge, peering down. She could see the queen darting at the incoming waves as if she could stop them with her violently beating wings. Then she'd streak back, out of Manoli's line of sight, while the rest of the creatures kept milling and swooping, rather like frightened herd beasts running about aimlessly when wild wherries circled their herd. The queen was shrieking at the top of her shrill little voice, obviously trying to get them to do something. Unable to imagine what the emergency could be, Manoli leaned just a little farther over the edge. The whole of the cliff gave way. Clutching wildly at seagrasses, Manoli tried to prevent her fall, but the seagrass slipped cuttingly through her hand and she slid over the edge and down. She hit the beach with a force that sent a shock through her body, but the wet sand absorbed a good deal of the impact. She lay where she'd fallen for a few minutes, trying to get her breath into her lungs and out again. Then she scrambled to her feet and crawled away from an incoming wave. She looked up the side of the bluff, rather daunted by the fact that she'd fallen a dragon length or more. And how was she going to climb back up? But as she examined the cliff face, she could see that it was not so unscalable as she'd first thought. Almost straight up, yes, but pocked by ledges and holes. Please stop. Those are my good scissors.
Can I have other scissors then?
Not right now. And I don't want you cutting things up on the couch. It'll make a giant mess. You can do it in your room, okay? Chaz.
I'm just making a little thing like this.
Okay. Almost straight up, yes, but pocked by ledges and holes, some fairly large. If she could find enough footholds and handholds, she'd be able to make it. She dusted the sand from her hands and started to walk towards one end of the little cove to begin a systematic search for the easiest way up. She'd gone only a few paces when something dove at her, screeching in fury. Her hands went up to protect her face as the little queen came diving down at her. Now Manoli recalled the curious behavior of the fire lizards. The little queen acted as if she were protecting something from Manoli as well as the encroaching sea, and she looked about her. She was within handspans of stepping into a fire lizard clutch. "Oh, I'm sorry, I wasn't looking. Don't be mad at me," Manoli cried as the little fire lizard came at her again. "Please stop, I won't hurt them." To prove her sincerity, Manoli backtracked to the far end of the beach. There she had to duck under a small overhang. When she looked around, there wasn't a sign of the little queen. Manoli's relief was short-lived, for how was she to find a way up the cliff if the little fire lizard kept attacking her every time she approached the eggs? Manoli hunched down, trying to get comfortable in her cramped refuge. Maybe if she kept away from the eggs? Manoli peered up the cliff directly above her. There were some likely-looking holds. She eased herself out the far side, keeping one eye on the clutch, basking in the hot sun, and reached for the first ledge. Immediately, the fire lizard came at her. "Oh, leave me alone! Ow! Go away! I'm trying to!" The fire lizard's talon had raked her cheek. "Please, I won't hurt your eggs!" The little queen's next pass just missed Manoli, who ducked back under the ledge. Blood oozed from the long scratch, and Manoli dabbed at it with the edge of her tunic. "Haven't you got any sense?" Manoli demanded of her now invisible attacker. What would I want with your silly eggs? Keep 'em. I just want to get home. Can't you understand? I just want to go home." Maybe if I sit very still, she'll forget about me, Manoli thought, and pulled her knees up under the chin, but her toes and elbows protruded from under the overhang. Suddenly, a bronze fire lizard materialized above the clutch, squeaking worriedly. Manoli saw the queen swooping to join him, so the queen must have been on the top of the ledge, just waiting for Manoli to break cover. "And to think I made up a pretty tune about you," Manoli thought as she watched the two lizards hovering over the eggs. "The last tune I ever made up. You're ungrateful, that's what you are." Despite her discomfort, Manoli had to laugh. What an impossible situation. Held under a cramped ledge by a creature no bigger than her forearm. At the sound of her laughter, the two lizards disappeared. Frightened, were they, of laughter? "A smile wins more than a frown," Mavi was fond of saying. Maybe if I keep laughing, they'll know I'm friendly. Or get scared away long enough for me to climb up. Saved by a laugh. Manoli began to chuckle in earnest, for she had also seen that the tide was coming in rather quickly. She eased out of her shelter, flung the carry sack over her shoulder, and started to climb. But it proved impossible to chuckle and climb. She needed breath for both. Abruptly, both the little queen and the bronze were back to harry her, flying at her head and face. The fragile-looking wings were dangerous when used as a weapon. No longer laughing, Manoli ducked back under her ledge, wondering what to do next. If laughter had startled them, what about a song? Maybe if she gave that pair a chorus of her tune, they'd let her go. It was the first time she'd sung since she'd seen the lizard, so her voice sounded rough and uncertain. Well, the lizards would know what she meant, she hoped, so she sang the saucy little song to no one. Well, so much for that notion, Manoli muttered under her breath, which makes the lack of interest in your singing absolutely unanimous. No audience? Not a fire lizard's whisker in sight? As fast as she could, Manoli slipped from her shelter and came face to face for a split second with two fire lizard faces. She ducked down, and they evidently disappeared because when she cautiously peered again, the ledge where they'd been perched was empty. She had the distinct impression that their expressions had registered curiosity and interest. Look, if wherever you are you can hear me, will you stay there and let me go? Once I'm on the top of the cliff, I'll serenade you till the sun goes down. Just let me get up there. She started to sing a dutiful dragon song as she once again emerged from her refuge. She was about 5 steps upward when the queen fire lizard emerged with help. With squeaks and squeals, she was driven back down. She could even hear claws scraping on the rock above her. She must have quite an audience by now, when she didn't need one. Cautiously, she looked up at the fascinated whirling of 10 pairs of eyes. Look, a bargain. One long song, and then let me up the cliff. Is that agreed? Fire lizard eyes whirled. Manoli took it that the bargain was made, and sang. Her voice started a flutter of surprised and excited chirpings, and she wondered if by any possible freak they actually understood what she was singing about grateful holds honoring dragon riders. By the last verse, she eased out into the open, awed by the sight of a queen fire lizard and 9 bronzes, entranced by her performance. Can I go now? She asked, and put one hand on the ledge. The queen dived for her hand, and Manoli snatched it back. I thought we'd struck a bargain. The queen chirped piteously, and Manoli realized that there had been no menace in the queen's action. She simply wasn't allowed to climb. You don't want me to go? Manoli asked. The queen's eyes seemed to glow more brightly. But I have to go. If I stay, the water will come up and drown me. And Manoli accompanied her words with explanatory gestures. Suddenly, the queen let out a shrill cry, seemed to hold herself midair for a moment, and then, her bronzes in close pursuit, she glided down the sandy beach to her clutch. She hovered over the eggs, making the most urgent and excited sounds. You're going to make a mess. Go get a spoon. If the tide was coming in fast enough to endanger Manoli, it was also frighteningly close to swamping the nest. The little bronzes began to take up the queen's plaint, and several, greatly daring, flew about Manoli's head and then circled back to the clutch. I can come there now? You won't attack me? Manoli took a few steps forward. The tone of the cries changed, and Manoli quickened her step. As she reached the nest, the little queen secured 1 egg from the clutch. With a great laboring of her wings, she bore it upward. That the effort was great was obvious. The bronzes hovered anxiously, squeaking their concern, but being much smaller, they were unable to assist the queen. Now Manoli saw that the base of the cliff at this point was littered with broken shelves and the pitiful bodies of tiny fire lizards, their wings half extended and glistening with egg fluid. The little queen now had raised the egg to a ledge, which Manoli had not previously noticed, about a half-dragon length up the cliff face. Manoli could see the little queen deposit the egg on the ledge and roll it with her forelegs toward what must be a hole in the cliff. It was a long moment before the queen reappeared again. Then she dove towards the sea, hovering over the foamy crest of a wave that rolled in precariously close to the endangered clutch. With a blurred movement, the queen was hovering in front of Manoli and scolding like an old aunt. Although Manoli couldn't help grinning at the thought, she was filled with a sense of pity and admiration for the courage of the little queen, single-handedly trying to rescue her clutch. If the dead fire lizards were that fully formed, the clutch was near to hatching. No wonder the queen could barely move the eggs. You want me to help you move the eggs, right? Well, we'll see what I can do. Ready to jump back if she had mistaken the little queen's imperious command, Manoli very carefully picked up an egg. It was warm to the touch and hard. Dragon eggs, she knew, were soft when first laid, but hardened slowly on the hot sands of the hatching grounds in the weirs. These definitely must be close to hatching. Closing the fingers of her damaged hand carefully around the egg, Manoli searched for and found foot and hand holds and reached the queen's ledge. She carefully deposited the egg. The little queen appeared, one front talon resting proprietarily on the egg, and then she leaned forward towards Manoli's face, so close that the fantastic motion of the many-faceted eyes were clearly visible. The queen gave a sort of sweet chirp, and then, in a very businesslike manner, began to scold Manoli as she rolled her egg to safety. Manoli managed 3 eggs in her hand the next time, but it was obvious that between the onrushing tide and the startling number of eggs in the clutch, there'd be quite a race. If the hole were bigger, she told the little queen as she deposited 3 eggs, some of the bronzes could help you roll. The queen paid her no attention, busy pushing the 3 eggs one at a time to safety. Manoli peered into the opening, but the fire lizard's body obscured any view. If the hole was bigger, and the ledge consequently broader, Manoli could bring the rest of the eggs up in her carry sack. Hoping that she wouldn't pull down the cliffside and bury the queen, clutch and all, Manoli prodded cautiously at the mouth of the opening. The queen took to scolding frantically as Manoli brushed the rubble from the ledge. Then she felt around the opening. There seemed to be a solid stone just beyond. Manoli yanked away at the loose rock until she had a nice tunnel exposed with a slightly wider opening. Ignoring the little queen's furious complaints, Manoli climbed down, unslinging her sack when she reached the ground. When the little queen saw Manoli putting the eggs into the sack, she began to have hysterics, beating at Manoli's head and hands. "Now look here," Manoli said sternly, "I am not stealing your eggs. I am trying to get them all to safety in jig time. I can do it with the sack, but not by the handful." Manoli waited a moment, glaring at the little queen who hovered at eye level. "Do you understand me?" Manoli pointed to the waves more vigorously dashing up the small beach. "The tide is coming in. Dragons couldn't stop it now." Manoli put another egg carefully in the sack. As it was, she'd have to make 2, maybe 3 trips or risk breaking eggs. "I take this," and she gestured up to the ledge. "Up there. Do you understand, you silly beast?" Evidently the little creature did, because crooning anxiously, she took her position on the ledge, her wings half extended and twitching as she watched Manoli's progress up to her. Manoli could climb faster with 2 hands, and she could, carefully, roll the eggs from the mouth of the sack well down the tunnelway. "You'd better get the bronzes to help you now, or we'll have the ledge stacked too high." It took Manoli 3 trips in all, and as she made the last climb, the water was a foot's width from the clutch. The little queen had organized her bronzes to help, and Manoli could hear her scolding tones echoing in what must be a fair-sized cave beyond the tunnel. Not surprising, since these bluffs were supposed to be riddled with caverns and passages. Manoli gave a last look at the beach, water at least ankle deep on both ends of the little cove. She glanced upward, past the ledge. She was a good halfway up the cliff now, and she thought she could see enough hand and footholds ahead. "Goodbye!" She was answered by a trill of chirps, and she chuckled as she imagined the scene, the queen marshalling her bronzes to position her eggs just right. Manoli did not make the cliff top without a few anxious moments. She was exhausted when she finally flopped on the sea grasses at the summit, and her left hand ached from unaccustomed gripping and effort. She lay there for some time, until her heart stopped thudding in her ribs and her breath came more easily. An inshore breeze dried her face, cooling her, but that reminded her of the emptiness of her stomach. Her exertions had reduced the rolls in her pouch to crumbly fragments, which she gobbled as fast as she could find them. All at once the enormity of her adventure struck her, and she was torn between laughter and awe. To prove to herself that she'd actually done what she remembered, she crept cautiously to the bluff edge. The beach was completely under water. The sandy wallow where the fire lizard eggs had baked was being tide-swept smooth. The rubble that had gone over the edge with her had been absorbed or washed away. When the tide retreated, all evidence of her energies to save herself and the clutch would be obliterated. She could see the protuberance of rock down which the queen had rolled her eggs, but not a sign of a fire lizard. The waves crashed with firm intent against the dragonstones when she gazed out to sea, but no bright motes of color flitted against the somber crags. Manoli felt her cheek. The fire lizard scratch was crusted with dried blood and sand. So it did happen. However did the little queen know I could help her? No one had ever suggested that fire lizards were stupid. Certainly they'd been smart enough for endless turns to evade every trap and snare laid to catch them. The creatures were so clever, indeed, that there was a good deal of doubt about their existence, except as figures of overactive imaginations. However, enough trustworthy men had actually seen the creatures at a distance, like her brother Alemi when he'd spotted some about the Dragonstones, that most people did accept their existence as fact. Manoli could have sworn that the